Also, before we get started, just a short disclaimer that all this information is provided in good faith and should not be intended for investment, tax, or legal advice. And now on to our featured presenter, Bob Maltsbarger, PhD. He's a senior research economist with the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute at the University of Missouri. And with that, Bob, I am going to make you presenter and you can take it away. And we can see your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kyle. And thank you for the introduction. As he said, my name is Bob Maltsbarger. I am a senior research economist at the University of Missouri, and I work with FAPRI. Those of you that aren't familiar with FAPRI, it stands for the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute. It was started back in 1983, and the goal was to provide objective policy analysis and market analysis that could be used by policy makers as well as industry analysts to help guide policy for farmers and farm programs. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. The agenda today that I have is I'm going to be going through some of the FAPRI baseline that we put out in the spring. That's a process that gets started back in November, and we provide a baseline, preliminary baseline that we actually get to review in Washington, D.C. in December, where we have industry participants as well as government participants and staffers, and they come in and USDA analysts, and they kind of give us feedback, similar to something that like what the CBO does with their agriculture outlooks. And then in January, we revisit that. We create the deterministic baseline. It's a 10-year outlook. And then after that, we provide some stochastic analysis around that to capture 500 different solutions based on different weather, export demand, policy, and so on. And what I'm going to go through today is that outlook that looks at some of the things that we have in our baseline projections, for starting with crops, going to livestock, then switching over to the financials, covering more of the expenses, the producer paid indexes, kind of a summary with the farm income outlook, and then we'll jump into some uncertainties before we open the floor for questions. So to get started, I wanted to highlight first kind of some context of what we're looking at going into this new year in 2023. For the last 3 years, we have seen a run up in prices, in crop prices specifically, and from the lows that we saw in the 1920 marketing year, which ended up in the first half of 2020, when we saw the COVID pandemic really bottom out those crop prices around that March timeframe of 2020. After that, we saw prices rising for the last couple of years on a number of different reasons, which I'll get into the next page. But we kind of peaked out in 2022, which that's where that black line is there for corn prices on the left and soybean prices on the right. And the outlook that you see on the blue line is actually our 10-year baseline for those prices that we estimated, that we worked on in January and we published back in March. And that baseline provides a good starting point that we do for scenario analysis for different policyholders and different stakeholders in the industry. They contact us, especially this year, which is a Farm Bill year, and we do different types of policy changes that could affect the outlook on farm income, farm prices, and government outlays based on different potential reference prices, different potential policies, margin policies, price policies, and so on. But you can see back in January when we were working on this, we projected prices in the next 10 years to fall pretty much from the peaks that we saw in the 22-23 marketing year, which is we're still working on finishing up. And on those red lines, those are just some of the futures prices that I picked for December futures and for corn and November futures for soybeans. And I picked, it was last week on the close for March 5th. But this kind of shows you how in line our thoughts were a few months ago on what's happening with prices. One thing one of my mentors always used to like to say is the cure for high prices is high prices, and that seems to be an indicator of what's going on now. So why did prices go up for crops and livestock in 2022? Well, one of the big things that was in the news in February and March of last year was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We saw the futures markets light up at that point, and they kept going higher and higher and started coming off in that June timeframe. Another thing that we had to address last year was weather. Bad weather in other countries as well as the United States. For other countries, it reduced our soybean crops in Brazil last year, and then we have the severe drought in Argentina this year, reducing their corn and soybean crops. And then we saw reduced U.S. wheat, cotton, and corn production back last year because of our droughts, and that also affected cattle inventories, which will have multiple year effects on beef production and prices in the future for that category. Other stuff that was going on that I'm going to talk about later on in the presentation is avian influenza. Briefly about how we didn't go into recession last year that some people were thinking about, and but we did experience very high and increasing expenses the last 2 years, as well as a shift in expansion of renewable biodiesel, specifically renewable diesel and not the FAME. So briefly touching on weather. So last year when we were looking at the droughts that we had in the Southern Plains and throughout the plains of the United States, this was just the third year in a row of droughts that we experienced across the United States. And it was the third year in a row of La Nina. La Nina can have different impacts across different years, but on average, we do see droughts in the United States during La Nina years. And that's what happened for the last 3 years in a row. In this graphic here, I had 3 different time periods. I just picked middle of July for 2020, 2021, and 2022. But you can see that much of the West and the plains saw some dryness and drought in 2020, but it accelerated in 2021, especially in the northern plains and in the Southwest. And then it persisted in the Southwest, and then it accentuated in the southern plains last summer. So moving to area planted, this is kind of more of a forward look, but back in January and working on the baseline, we put out these estimates and we tried to get a good economic look at what's going to happen the next year for area in the United States. And this table here gives you a real quick snapshot of what that was, as well as incorporating the March 31st planting intentions report from the USDA, which is always much anticipated. And I have a quick comparison to see how close we came this year. The USDA goes through and provides a survey of farmers to get a good idea, where ours was an economic outlook, looking at what the expectations are based on price and costs. And this year we came very close to what the March planting intentions were. If you look at the 12 crop total, we were within 800,000 acres of the March planting intentions. What this does is this estimate, this outlook that we had for the United States field crops for the top 12 crops is an increase of 4.2 million acres this year over what we experienced last year. Even though we have experienced strong expenses, those high prices still incentivize farmers to continue to expand planting. And one of the challenges here is there is a strong assumption here that we will have less prevented plantings this year than we did in 2022. So that 4.2 million acres is a pretty big jump year over year, but it's largely influenced by our expectations of what's happening with soybeans and corn. So soybeans and corn are the big winners, and cotton was the big loser year over year for the number of acres going into the ground this spring. Moving on to receipts. One of the big things I like to talk about receipts is going into a new crop year is we have the expectation of average weather. Why do we say average weather? One, we're not meteorologists, we're not climate scientists. And we know from those people that do that even 8 to 10 days out is pretty sketchy sometimes. So we don't try to assume what is going to happen in the next year for the crop as far as weather goes. And invited into that assumption is our trend yields. So similar to what the USDA does and other agencies and other government organizations that look at projections and forecasts in the future, we all typically tend to use trend yields. The reason we do that is over time, crops, productivity of crops, technology used for those crops helps to increase yields over time. And even though they come in jumps and spurts, the trend yield fits best when you look at about 20, 30 year shift of productivity of plants over the time. So incorporating that average weather, incorporating that assumption of trend yields, what we see is an increase of production in 2023. And that's led largely by corn for feed grains and soybeans for oil seeds. And we see production increasing on top of those area I just talked about. Those yields increasing to trend yields gives us a 1.5 billion bushel increase in corn and 177 million bushel increase in soybeans. But even though we have production increasing, we also, as you saw in one of those first graphics, we have the projection of crop prices decreasing. And for 2023, the crop price decreases more than compensate for the increase in production. And we project that total crop receipts for 2023 decreases by 6%. For this graphic, I have other crops in just one big lump there. In this next graphic, I tried to break those out a little bit more into some of those specialty crops. Specialty crops had some of the similar moves as the rest of the field crops do as far as receipts go. They increased 2% in 21. We had a bigger increase in 2022, and we project a decrease of about 4% in 23. Specialty crops move a little bit differently than field crops. One, because they're grown in different areas or a little more concentrated areas, especially fruits and vegetables out in California, tree nuts in California, and then specialty crops, potatoes, Idaho, Washington, and then we do have some potatoes up in the Northeast and other crops and so on. So apples and different types of crops. So what we saw in 2022 was that persistent drought that I showed you in the drought monitor chart, is that it had an effect, especially out in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and it limited a lot of that water availability to those farmers. Well, we are the largest exporter in the world of almonds, which is grown only commercially in California, where we export 90% of almonds for the world. That makes for a very inelastic export demand, and that whenever we have a bad year, it runs up those prices. And we have some of that similar effect going on for other tree crops and some of those fruits and vegetables in California. And that was a big push, is even though we had a decrease in production, we had an increase in receipts because of strong prices. And kind of the opposite is what we project in 2023. California went from 3 years of extreme drought to flooding and over average Sierra snowpack. So we do expect some of that water return this year. We don't know the full effect of the flooding on some of those plantations and some of those strawberry crops and so on, but knowing we're going to have water this year, the return of trend yields does seem pretty likely, at least compared to the last 3 years. Shifting over to livestock a little bit, I did want to jump into cattle. I did mention that big Southern Plains drought that we had last year. Well, that Southern Plains drought really made a large impact on cattle producers, ranging from Nebraska all the way down to Texas. We saw farms that could not grow hay, could not ship hay profitably. We saw wells dry up in Texas, so they couldn't get water even if they could get forage at a more expensive price. And we saw a big liquidation of the national beef herd because of that. And if you look back, the last couple contraction cycles in the United States, back in '96 and then again in 2006, those two contraction cycles were approximately 8 years long. Well, for this contraction cycle, we're only in the 4th year so far, and we're already down to 38,500 head below the bottom of the last contraction cycle in 2014. The challenge for us is for those beef cows, those productive reproducing cows, is that's the smallest beef herd we've seen since 1963. So if we are actually in a contraction cycle that may last 4 more years, the challenge is how low do those beef cow herd numbers have to go, and how high do the prices need to go before we actually have herd retention and growth again. So in our baseline outlook, we basically say that those fewer beef cows are shifting and translating into less slaughter at the national level. You can see the beef cow herd started going down after the 2019 calendar year, has been shifting ever since. The interesting thing is that because of those drought conditions, especially some of those cow-calf areas, that profitability has not been strong enough to promote that herd retention I was talking about because of those high forage, feed, and hay prices. Well, what that means is we've sent more beef cows and heifers to slaughter, which has helped support that beef production and that meat going to the store shelves, but it definitely doesn't help us looking into the future. So even with the strong prices on the futures market right now for fed and feeder cattle, we don't really see that retention happening for a couple more years, which leads to those cattle prices staying high and going higher. So we have those cattle prices moving up to record highs, with fed prices potentially setting a new record. Actually, I think we've already set a new record here in 2023, even as that beef production is declining. And that assumes that we may have some shift backwards in per capita beef demand in the United States, which wasn't the case that happened in 2020 in our last down cycle for the global economy and the US economy. So one of the things is looking at feeder steer prices. We have those increasing, but the challenge of high feed cost really limits the amount that feedlots are willing and able to pay for those feeder animals. And it kind of puts at least a little bit of a limit on that feeder cattle price. But those increasing feeder cattle prices are likely to still continue for a few years until that beef cow herd can start being replenished. And then it will shift down to another contraction cycle. Sorry. Shifting over to hog production, we see the hog production margins continue to tighten. Even though some of those feed prices are starting to decline now that those crop prices are coming off their highs back in 2022, the hog profitability is going to squeeze faster than that because we see the hog prices coming off faster than feed costs. The breeding herd numbers are likely to remain relatively stable for the next couple of years. This leaves that productivity of those pigs per sow as the leading contributor to kind of what we see as a modest increase in pork production for 23. The growth in pork production per sow is expected to improve over the softness we saw in 2022 and hopefully get back up to some sort of more historical average. One of the big stories this last year, and it's continuing now, even though it's starting to slow, is what's been happening with the highly pathogenic avian influenza. I pulled up some graphics here, and I wanted to kind of give you a comparison of the impacts of what's happening in this 2022-2023 confirmed detections of the HPAI influence on what the flocks are happening and what's happening to eggs. In this series of these detections so far in 22-23, we've seen 833 confirmed flocks impacted. 325 of those have been commercial flocks. 508 of those have been backyard flocks for the 833, and almost 59 million birds were affected. This is a big deal, and it's much bigger than what happened in our last outbreak in 2014-15. Back in that outbreak, we saw a total of 232 flocks affected. And of those flocks, only 211 were commercial flocks, and a much smaller level for 21 backyard flocks. Even though there was a lot fewer flocks affected, some of those commercial flocks were a lot larger, and we actually had 50.4 million birds affected as of the last detection, which was back in June of 2015. So we can see that this impact has been larger as far as the number of birds affected, but a lot larger number of backyard flocks were affected than last time. and maybe that's because we just have more backyard flocks. I'm not sure on that one, but we do have a huge impact on eggs this year, and that's where this chart comes from. On the left here, you'll see the yellow is broiler production and black is turkey production. Even though we've had this huge impact of HPAI on the flocks for 2022, it was much less influential on the broiler flocks than it was on the laying flocks for chickens and for the turkey flocks. So we actually saw a decrease in turkey production last year in 2022 and a large decrease in egg production. So this, because of this larger influence on laying production, we did see a huge escalation in the price of eggs at retail. In some stores locally, we saw it nearing $5 per dozen, which now it's back down to below $2 per dozen locally. So that influence on that HPAI on eggs was a huge impact this year. And you could see that it made a huge check mark back in after 2015 when it hit its bottom. And we project a similar response this year to eggs recovering in 2023. The challenge is because of the influence of this highly pathogenic avian influenza last year, we saw a huge run up in prices for poultry and for eggs, and we see the opposite effect going into 2023. So first, I'd like to point out that the recovery and the increase for those turkeys and the chickens and the eggs are a strong recovery, a strong growth in 2023, but the price, as I said, is going to be much stronger on the influential side for receipts. Moving on to milk, I'd like to point out here that milk production that we have projected here is still going to grow in 2023 over 2022, but it's going to be a very modest growth. We have it growing modestly year over year, but this is in part largely due to how we've seen the dairy numbers play out over the last year on a month-to-month basis. We've seen the dairy monthly inventories for dairy cows since March 22 hover within about 13,000 head to around that 9.4 million head, despite having record high milk prices last spring. We see the high input costs, these feed costs I've already talked about, continuing to pressure margins for dairy producers. And that keeps dairy producers very cautious about potentially expanding the beef herd. In the recent dairy market news for the week ending April of 22nd, the cumulative dairy cow slaughter was pegged at over 1 million head this year so far. That's 100,000 head faster than the same time back in 2022. And that kind of gives me a little indication that farmers are feeling that margin squeeze and are reluctant to really put new dairy herd in the inventory as those feed costs remain historically elevated even as they start to decline. Just this week on Ag Day, it was reported that the margins have been tight enough this year in 2023 that the dairy margin coverage has had 3 payouts so far this year. The effect on dairy product prices will be kind of that decrease that I was talking about across different crops and across different categories for livestock. We see kind of the same thing. So even with below average milk production growth, the dairy product prices are projected to ease this year, even as we project some consumer demand to weaken. Though prices declined for those relatively high levels that we experienced in 2022, we still project them to remain above that 2010 to 2019 average level. Cheese prices declined less than butter and less than non-fat dry milk. And what happens, this helps bring that class 3 and the class 4 milk prices closer into alignment after we saw the large gaps in those prices in 2020 and 2022. So the effects of those supply and utilization projections that we have for livestock, we have it affecting the overall effect for livestock receipts as a decline similar to field crops. It's not consistent for livestock though, and the first thing is as I said before, hog prices are declining. This decline that we project in hog prices is going to more than offset the modest improvement in marketings, and it's going to reduce our swine receipts for 2023. Despite the improving broiler and turkey production, the weaker poultry and egg prices are going to drive that category lower as well. The big exception for livestock, the big exception for receipts overall is the livestock receipt projections we have for 2023. And these receipts we have moving higher. It is supported by record prices, but it's led by that tighter national inventories and the effect on marketings I was talking about. The combined livestock receipts declined nearly $21 billion in our projections, down to $237 billion. And this is an 8% decline overall from the highs that we saw in 2022. But the key here is this would still end as the best receipt number at the national level, the second best on record for livestock receipts for the nation. Shifting over to expenses, I posted a graphic here. This is a graphic that I used in the article that we published on the Knowledge Exchange with Farm Credit East. This highlights some of those price changes on the expense side that we've experienced since 2020. The bad news for the last couple of years is that after a slight decline of the combined producer price paid index, which includes all commodities, services, interest, taxes, wage rates back in 2020, most of the rest of the PPI since then increased in 2021 and 2022. The largest cost increase has been seen in fertilizers, fuels, and chemicals, which I highlighted here, with also strong increases in feed. The example I want to bring up here is first chemicals. It grew only 8% in 2021, so not a dramatic increase, but then it grew 39% in 2022. The second example is fuels. It actually declined in 2020 with the lockdowns that we experienced during the pandemic. It really decreased the transportation demand and really pulled down that overall fuels PPI. It decreased about 15% in 2020 on the annual average, but then it increased 33% in 2021 as people started driving more, and went up another 43% this last year. On the fertilizer side, I highlighted nitrogen here because it's so important to all crops, and it even has an influence on some of the prices that livestock producers can receive for the manure. So the nitrogen PPI across the last 2 years increased 96%. And this was a record high, the highest we've seen since April of 2008. And this wasn't the only record that we experienced in PPIs. Producers had paid more across all kinds of different inputs, but there were new records for many of these inputs, and fuel was one of the big ones, and nitrogen was the other. Once we drill down to the actual expenses, I wanted to highlight those fertilizers here. I pulled in the USDA AMS prices of Illinois, which are mostly FOB prices, except for the UAN, which is a delivered price, which is why it's so much higher. On the left-hand side, I highlighted nitrogen price shifts since using quarterly averages since 2021. Those are on a dollars per nitrogen pound basis, and to kind of make them equivalent. And you can see that the price increase that increased back in 2020 for fertilizers did not peak until like that PPI did in April. And depending on which fertilizer you're looking at, whether it was anhydrous or urea, MAP, DAP, potash, most of them peaked between April and June of last year. The run-up was largely caused by a whole combination of complex different scenarios. Back in 2020, we experienced some disasters with the hurricane, the freeze in Texas. Those types of things shut down some of that production capacity for the United States, which helped push up that natural gas price, which is a leading input for nitrogen products. Well, not only that, but after the pandemic, we've had labor issues, we've had supply chain issues, and that helped push it up more in 2021. Well, towards the end of 2021, we really saw an acceleration of nitrogen in the fourth quarter of 2021 and then into the first quarter of 2022. Well, the fourth quarter of 2021, we saw accumulation of different types of things, but one of the things that we did see back in 2021 was the influence of combinations of tariffs on different fertilizers. We had restrictions on Belarus, we had restrictions on Morocco, and then going into 2022, we saw some temporary restrictions by China on urea. We saw some restrictions from Russia, and then we had the invasion of Russia and Ukraine. Well, that really disrupted the expectations of what was happening with natural gas in the European Union, and we saw natural gas prices go through the roof. Natural gas prices in the US skyrocketed, but nothing compared to what happened in the European Union. We even saw nitrogen production capacity shut down temporarily in the European Union because they could not produce it. They could not get the natural gas that they needed at a reasonable price, and so they shut down capacity temporarily. Well, after we saw kind of the easing of the market prices for futures for our crops, we also saw an easing of natural gas prices. In part, we saw things kind of ease a little bit, but natural gas stayed pretty high, especially through the beginning of our 2022 winter. Once we actually saw a more mild winter in the Northern Hemisphere, we saw those natural gas prices come off. And now in the United States, the natural gas futures are down to one of the lowest points since 2020. And this has influenced the spot prices. The challenge for farmers is you farmers will lock in fertilizer prices in the fall for some winter application and anhydrous, as also for some of those spring applications to lock it in for the fall so to make sure they have it. And so that, even though we've seen spot prices come off for fertilizers, the influence on expenses is not a one-for-one. And that's where this chart comes from. In this chart, I focused more on the expenses and not necessarily the prices themselves. So the decreases that I was talking about previously, feed, fertilizer, and fuel expenses, basically is not enough to offset the other rising expenses for 2023. Those higher fertilizer, fuel, feed costs, chemical costs contribute to the very sharp price increase and the very sharp expense increase of 19% in 2022, after already increasing in 2021. The other expenses, such as wage rates, interest expense, rent, all of those plus others, chemical costs, are projected in our baseline to increase in 2023. Those increases have a large influence and more than offset our decreases for feed costs, our decreases for fuel, our decreases for fertilizer. And all those costs together may be a more modest increase for 2023 than what we experienced the last 2 years, but it's still more expensive for farmers to grow crops, still more expensive for farmers to grow livestock. And so those expenses go up, and that squeezes the bottom line, not just for individual operations, but for the nation's farm income. So after this year, though, even though typically expense prices are sticky and lag crop price movements, livestock price movements, even though they lag, the next couple of years we do have a decrease in expenses. It's very modest, but overall, in 2024, the combined expense decrease is 4%. And then we have a little bit more decrease in 2025. The other expenses continue to rise in 24, 25, and 26, the combined other expenses. But the decreases that we see in feed, the decreases that we see in purchased livestock do make a difference, and overall expenses are going to decrease the next couple of years unless we see some sort of shift or disruption in the market. Moving from expenses, I wanted to visit briefly on government payments, because it has a large influence on the bottom line for farmers and the bottom line for farm income around the United States. Looking backwards first, you can see in the blue, the commodity programs up through about 2005 made a larger share of total government outlays that went to farm income. So those Title I programs made a much larger influence on what was happening to farmer income than what's happening in the last 10, 15 years. Once we get into the early 2000s, we start to see a little bit of a shift, especially in about 2007. We see a shift lower in those commodity program payments. We do see a shift higher in the crop insurance. So the crop insurance changes in the Farm Bill did have an influence on increase in payments for crop insurance. We also see a light increase since about 2010 in conservation payments, although that stays relatively stable basically since 2010. There's some marginal increases. The big thing I want to focus on here is basically the fiscal year of 2019 until the fiscal year of 2022. This historical fiscal years were largely influenced not by commodity programs, not by insurance, even though crop insurance was an important part a couple of years, especially after the 2019 flooding. But largely, and the majority of the influence was because of ad hoc payments. Those ad hoc payments include a wide variety of different things. It started with the MFP payments, which is those market facilitation payments. Those were made for impacts related to the foreign retaliatory tariffs. That was during the Trump administration with the China trade war. Those were payments that came ad hoc to basically supplement income farmers lost because of the trade war. After that, we've seen more pandemic-related payments. Those pandemic-related payments were a slew of different things. Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, the CFAP, Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP, the PAP, the Pandemic Assistance Payments. And also during that time, because of some of those hurricanes and the wildfires and the droughts that we experienced, we've seen disaster assistance. So the WIP Plus, which is wildfire and hurricane indemnity programs, and now that's shifted over to what we call the ERP or ELRP, the Emergency Relief Program and the Emergency Relief Livestock Programs. So those are those disaster payments, and those make up that red, the yellow, and then that light gray payments leading up to the 22 fiscal year. That total payment has averaged $42 billion per year over the last 4 years. That is double the average of the previous 20 years. And it's all because of those ad hoc payments that we don't typically experience, or at least haven't historically, except for exceptional years. So this is the outlook that I have for those government costs, those government outlays. Federal spending on farm-related programs, as I mentioned, was above the historic norm between 2019 and 2020, largely because of those short-term disaster and ad hoc programs. The current policy baseline that we have does not assume new ad hoc programs. And because of that, our farm-related outlays decline in the fiscal years for 2023 and the fiscal year for 2024. One thing you can notice here is the crop losses that we experienced in 2022 result in budgetary costs for the crop insurance programs for 2023. So that's that big black expansion on the 2023 line. Crop insurance that we have accounts for about 45% of our projected spending across major farm-related programs for our next decade, our 10-year baseline. Commodity programs for spending associated with Title I of the Farm Bill is relatively low for the fiscal year of 23 and 24, but we have it rebounding in the later years, largely given to the projected changes that we have for prices and the projected changes we have for program payment triggers under the Price Loss Coverage Program, PLC, and the Agriculture Risk Coverage Program called ARC. So visiting this ARC and PLC program just briefly, I have some historical reference here and a little bit projected, kind of average to give you an idea of those shifts under different payment programs. So under the 2014 Farm Bill, the national average ARC payments per participating corn base acre exceeded PLC payments. Under the 2018 Farm Bill, which is what we're still under right now, the changing market conditions reduced corn payments under both programs. To date, no PLC payments have been made to soybean producers. Projected average payments, which I mentioned before, we have going up in the 24 to 28 average period for both crops and for both programs. Why is that? Why do we have it going up? And that's what I was mentioning with those prices and those triggers. So price loss coverage or PLC payments occur when marketing year average prices are below the effective reference price. Agriculture risk coverage payments occur when the county per acre revenue drops below a trigger that is based on an 86% of the Olympic average marketing year average price multiplied times the Olympic average of county yields. Projected marketing year average prices decline even as we have the Olympic average price of past prices helping to push up both the ARC and PLC payment triggers. Though the effective reference price can only exceed the statutory reference price by no more than 15%. So what these charts are showing you is that the effective reference price and the 86% of Olympic average for ARC are going up, not because we want them to in the first couple of years, but because of the effect of higher prices up through 22, 23 marketing year. So this has a strong influence because those lagged Olympic year averages are lagged a year. And the effects of rising prices have an effect moving into the future. And that draws our declining projection baseline price closer to or below those trigger prices. Now you can see for the soybean price, we don't have the marketing average price going down to or below the effective reference price for PLC or the 86% price of Olympic average for ARC. Yet that we had those increases in outlays. Why is that? That is the nature of our simulated stochastic runs, those 500 different solutions I briefly mentioned at the beginning that we do that take into account different potential yield scenarios based on historical weather impacts that could happen into the future, different effects on GDP, export demand, and so on. And those 500 solutions takes that average price, that marketing year average price in our baseline I'm showing here in green, much higher and much lower in each of those solutions than what I showed here. And because we have that simulated 500 solutions, we take an average or a mean of those outlays to give us the potential future government costs that could happen in the next 10 years. And that goes back to our scenario analysis that we do for the Ag, Senate, and House committees, and some of the work we do for the USDA and Office Chief Economist, so we can look at different impacts on government costs as the Farm Bill policies, those Title I policies may change. So that's why we have those government outlays increasing, even though these mean prices may or may not reach those triggers. So at a high level, what is the influence of what I've been talking about? It's this here. I provided a waterfall chart because I love the way they look of what's happened back in 2021 to 22 to what our projections are for 23. And this is the US level net farm income. So 2021 net farm income was a new record for the United States. Prices went up, expenses were going up, but they really did not see that acceleration in prices until the 22 and the 22-23 marketing year. The green is good for farmers, the red is bad for farmers. The green here we saw between 21 and 22 for the net farm income calendar year, receipts for crops went up $44.8 billion. Livestock receipts $61.9 billion. The challenge is what I talked about earlier with those expenses and those PPIs, is farmers had to pay a lot more to make those crops and make those livestock. And so we saw production expenses increase $68.9 billion, offsetting more than the increase in the total receipts for livestock. We also saw a decrease in the value of inventory changes based on having less crops, based on having less inventory. So even though we had some higher prices, the inventories decreased enough that we saw changes in that, as well as those government outlays that I showed you in the fiscal year went down for 22. So that had an effect of a negative nearly $16 billion in net farm income. Even with those negatives, those receipts increased enough to give us a brand new record for U.S. net farm income for 2022. The challenge moving forward is we have more red categories than we have green going to this 2023 net farm income. We see receipts going down for crops. That's for field crops, specialty crops, tree crops across the board. Not every crop goes down necessarily, but generally speaking, on the aggregate, we see crop receipts going down, even as some production goes up, so receipts fall. Livestock receipts, prices are going down for poultry and eggs. We don't have strong prices for milk. We see product prices for milk products going down. We see hog prices weakening. The only exception is those cattle prices. But that effect of the increase in cattle receipts still gives us a net negative in our projections of almost $21 billion this year over what we experienced last year. And then we have production expenses. Even though this shows a negative, that means it's an increase in expenses. That's that extra 2% increase in expenses that we have overall. We have $10.4 billion increase in expenses. And even with better production, better inventories, we do have some increase in those value of inventory changes. And the net ends up being a $37 billion decrease. I'm sorry, it's not a $37 billion. It's about a $31 billion decrease in net farm income for the United States. But what I wanted to say, that $37 billion is still above what we had for net farm income in 2020. Although farm income declines to a baseline, the 10-year average that we have, because we do this out for 10 years, it remains above the average that we experienced in the 2011 to 2014 average, and well above the average of that kind of the last low period of net farm income between 2015 and 2019. So given this nice outlook that I talked about, there's always uncertainties. There's always unexpected risks that go on that can really dramatically change our baseline projections. The ones I want to bring up today, first, the Farm Bill. We're in a Farm Bill year. We don't know if a Farm Bill will happen. The leaders in the House and the Senate are confident and report almost daily that we're going to have a Farm Bill this year. But it's not expected before the August recess. And there's still a lot of work that needs to happen, and there's a lot of agreements and negotiations that need to take place before it happens, if it's going to get done this year. If that happens, and we have a new baseline, all of a sudden, we potentially, unless they continue the current policies kind of as given, we have a new set of policy assumptions, and our baseline government outlays can shift significantly or modestly, depending on what those policy shifts may be. Also, I mentioned earlier, we assumed average weather. With that average weather assumption, we have trim yields for crops. Trim yields largely depend on favorable planting, growing, and harvest conditions. And if anybody follows INSO, which is the El Nino Southern Oscillation Index projections, they're looking, at least the probabilities are increasing, that they're going to shift into El Nino territory this summer. The bad news is this may mean drier conditions across portions of the U.S., specifically portions of the Southwest, the Four Corners states. In the East, especially hovering around DC, the states around DC, and some of the Northeast states as well throughout this 2023 growing season. Another big risk and uncertainty is what's happening with interest rates. We continue to see interest rates increases by the Fed. It was only 25 points this last time, but if interest rates continue to increase, that means higher interest expense on operating loans and potentially higher interest rates if you're going to purchase some land. One of the big things around that interest rate increases, and one of the reasons we may or may not have them increase anymore, is our effect or the risk of recession. And I can't tell you for sure that it's greater or less than people were projecting 6 months ago. I know when we were looking at the preliminary baseline back in November, our data source for macroeconomic data, they projected a recession in 23 for the US. By January, they took that recession out. And if you've looked at the news in the last couple of days, S&P Global, which projects real GDP for the United States and around the world, they lower their US GDP, real GDP estimate to only increase 1.2% in this year. And they decreased their estimate for 2024 to increase only 0.9%. Well, even though that's really small, it's still not a recession. So, but with slower real GDP, sometimes that means slower consumer demand at the grocery store. We'll have to wait and see on that one. Then the biggest uncertainty that's very near and dear to our hearts is what's happening right now in Russian-Ukraine war and how it evolves, and more importantly, what's happening with the Grain Corridor Agreement, which expires on the 18th. Just earlier this week, it was reported by Reuters that the UN said no ships were inspected on either Sunday or Monday. Inspections continued on Tuesday, and then it was announced that there were meeting and negotiations were going to start, which started yesterday and continue today. But it's hard to say what's going to happen, but the news is optimistic that something will take place potentially for another 60 days. How that comes about is yet to be seen. The other big thing I always like to speak about, talking about uncertainties, is weather. We continue to have a drought. I pulled the new drought monitor this morning. Southern Plains, Mid Plains, Upper Plains, all the way through South Dakota, we've got drought. We've got drought in through Missouri. We still have some drought out west, but it's mostly in Oregon and then up into Montana on top of Idaho. This affects crops. This affects planting. Planting for row crops or corn, rice, and soybeans are ahead of schedule. Because it's been a little dry, people will still be able to get stuff in the ground. Doesn't mean it will be good for them sprouting. Winter wheat conditions remain horrible. 44%, very poor to poor. And I saw in the news, it was reported that's the worst since like 1989. And back in 1989, winter wheat abandonment was nearly 30% in Kansas. So Kansas makes up 22% of winter wheat for the United States, Oklahoma 13%, Texas 17%. All of those are in pretty rough shape. So we don't really know what's happening with that winter wheat condition. It's possible that some will be grazed on, some will be cut early if it's green enough to go to hay, and maybe they can replant some summer forage. That's very unknown, but it's possible. But even that summer forage hope depends on getting some summer precipitation, which we're supposed to be getting some today in some of those areas, but it has to be a bit more persistent and consistent if we're going to come out of those severe droughts. That El Nino I talked about, the probability in mid-April, according to IRI, and it's very similar for the NOAA projections, it's about 70% that we're going to have El Nino for May, June, and July. On the right is the IRI. It's Columbia University's climate program. They have percentiles of dryness for El Nino for the United States here. And the darker orange, yellow, and orange it is, the drier it is. And you can see that four corners I mentioned. There's some in the southern east part of the Corn Belt can be dry, but the real drought comes over in the eastern states, and then some dryness again in the northeast. So the big takeaways I want to mention is for 2023, we see prices declining for most crops and most livestock categories with the exception of cattle and calves. Because of that, we see receipts for most crops and livestock categories decline because the price declines outweigh the projected increases in production. Some expenses decline for 23. The costs historically have remained sticky, and they typically lag the crop and livestock price declines, which definitely affects that margin for the farmers. And despite national net farm income being historically elevated, what we are projecting for 23, this is not going to be distributed evenly across farm operations. And so it makes it extra critical this year that every operation really focus on those farm strategies, timing those purchases where you can, taking advantage of all risk management options for marketing to make sure that you are one of those farms that have a historically elevated net farm income for this calendar year and this marketing year. With that, we're going to open up to questions. I think Kyle may help monitor and facilitate that, and I can turn on my screen as well. Let me see here.
So with that, you can text chat in your questions at any point, but I think, Bob, one of the first questions, being in the Northeast, one of our major economy drivers in agriculture is the dairy industry. How do you see the talks, the negotiations, the new possible federal milk marketing orders affecting kind of the dairy and crop industry for the next coming year, the next couple years, and then you throw Farm Bill on top of that? Any thoughts, comments?
Well, a big part of it is some of the stuff I've already said. We've seen really tight margins. Ag Day on Tuesday said DMC program is paid out 3 times this year. Well, why does the dairy margin coverage program pay out? Because we have tight margins. We have expensive feed costs and relatively soft milk prices. Why do we get crop insurance payments? Is because typically something bad happens to your yields. County yields for ARC, prices drop below the market reference prices for PLC. Different things can happen this year because of these uncertainties with weather. And that El Nino doesn't just affect what's happening in the United States. So it negatively affects, say for example, La Nina is typically good for Australia and the Southeast Asia. You get better rains in Southeast Asia, you got better palm production, oil palm production's better, and you get cheaper palm oil in the export market, which has spillover price effects on the vegetable oil, which is good for consumers, not necessarily good for producers. Another thing is La Nina is good for Australia. That means better canola production, that means better wheat production, and better forage production for their cattle. They're a big exporter of beef. Same with New Zealand. But it's negative typically. A La Nina can be negative for, I believe, South Africa. It's negative, or El Nino, sorry, for South Africa and northern Brazil. It's better for Argentina though. So southern Brazil, it's dry for La Nina and Argentina is dry for La Nina, but the opposite is the effect for El Nino. And so there's a lot of things going on, and the Farm Bill is just one of those uncertainties. And that's a very complex discussion in trying to decide what's going to happen with that. I wish I had some really good inside news that I could share, but I do not. So one of those things I would like to know myself, because that makes it a lot easier to provide a baseline if we know what policy is going to shift to in the future, which is why we continue with no new policies and our baseline to kind of give us a good starting point for what would take place if those policies do change.
Okay. So you touched a little bit about Farm Bill and that it is a Farm Bill year, and here at Farm Credit, we monitor the Farm Bill very closely. They're predicting that this will be the first $1 trillion Farm Bill, and roughly 86% of that now is going to be for food assistance and SNAP programs, and the rest for farm programs, which is about a 10% increase over the previous Farm Bill years. How do you think the economics behind that will drive the Farm Bill discussions and the outcome for our farmers? Because without us producing the food, the food nutrition assistance programs would not exist. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, just at a high level, yes. So
Yeah.
the nutrition programs make up about 80%, sometimes more, sometimes less, but around 80% or more of the Farm Bill. Being that it's such a large budget portion of the Farm Bill, the effects of SNAP or nutrition, if that if that expense expands, it makes a challenge for the outlays that we can project or the budgeted outlays for policy expansion for commodity one type or Title One commodity programs. So if we really want to have higher reference prices for PLC or different types of price programs or margin programs that would increase the outlays for government costs, unless we see an overall appropriation increase for the overall budget, you're really challenged to stay within your means, so to speak, without something else going on. So I know in the news recently they were talking, hoping to maybe get some savings from the Inflation Reduction Act appropriations from conservation and shift it to Title One commodity programs. Um, who knows if that can happen or not? There is some hope there, and there are some commodity groups that are really pushing to increase reference prices. So I'm really not sure how much of that can take place, but there is questions and there are potential answers that people are proposing to help maybe shift some of those funds to actually help those Title One commodity programs. But I'm not sure how that's going to play out yet. I wish I could say, but it's possible that there's some negotiation that can go on. But we have to see that expansion of the overall budget if we expect to see larger commodity one government outlay projections and modifications to those policies.
Okay. So I don't have any other questions that came in, Bob, but with that, I think since we've hit the top of the hour, I think we're going to wrap it up. So
Okay.
we really appreciate you taking the time and speaking to us today, and also providing the article that you did for our insights and perspectives. And then before we wrap up, is there any quick takeaways? I know you hit on it one of your last slides, but any kind of points that you really want to drive home before we close out?
The biggest point that I hit on in the article and I touched on today is farmers know that just because prices are declining for farm diesel, for fertilizers, doesn't mean you're going to spend less than you did last year. Largely, it's because what you spent last year, what you spent this year largely has to do with timing. If you bought farm diesel in 22 in January, and then you bought it again in January of 23, even though it was declining from the peak that we saw last June and some of the highs in December, you're still paid more for farm diesel. So that affects your bottom line. And so whenever possible and wherever possible, trying to take advantage of those input cost strategies and as well as marketing strategies for the output is really what's going to help individual farm operations survive and have an historically elevated farm income year compared to what we had between 2015 and 2019.
Great. Thanks again, Bob. And then just as a final reminder for all the viewers on the line that all webinars past, present, and future live at farmcrediteast.com/webinars, as well as our YouTube channel. And with that, we will adjourn for the day, and I wish everybody a great rest of the day.